The galaxy begins not with silence, but with the unearthly howl of the Immaterium, a storm without horizon, a hunger without end. To those who have dared to look upon the warp with mortal eyes, reality itself seems to fracture. Walls bleed light, shadows breathe, and whispers coil like serpents in the skull. There is no sanctuary within its currents, no compass in its storms, only the desperate faith that the Astronomicon burns still, guiding mankind through that abyss. Yet behind the gates, beyond the thin veil of the Galar field, lurk forms older than empires and cruelties deeper than memory. The warp is not simply a place, it is a predator, patient and infinite, and every voyage through it is a prayer against annihilation. If you find yourself enthralled by this descent into the forgotten corners of the Imperium, consider lending strength to our vigil. Like, share, and subscribe, so that together we may endure the journey into the heart of darkness and carry this tale further into the void. The void ship drifted in silence, its hull a cathedral of iron and prayer, yet every rivet and seam seemed to tremble beneath the unseen pressure of the warp. Within the thin cocoon of the Galar field, reality still held, though just barely, as if a fragile lantern had been lit in the cavernous dark of some endless abyss. The air itself tasted of copper, ozone, and the bitter tang of fear. Men and women walked the corridors as if moving through a dream, their lips whispering half-remembered catechisms, every word a plea for deliverance. The hum of the plasma drives should have been steady, but tonight it came broken, fractured, with the sound of grinding metal beneath the rhythm. Tech priests scuttled about like insects, their mechadendrites probing conduits, their vox grills stammering praises to the omnisia. Sparks fell like falling stars in the hangar decks, where engines were coaxed back to life by chance as much as tools. None spoke of what pressed against the hull, though all felt it. The warp had moods, and this night it was hungry. In the crew holds, thousands huddled in tight rows, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breaths rising in a damp fog. A child whimpered in the dark, hushed quickly by a mother who stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, as if she could see beyond the steel bulkheads into the roiling sea of unreality outside. Veterans of the void called it the pressure, the sense that something enormous crouched just beyond sight, waiting for the smallest fracture in the veil. None dared to say the name aloud. None wanted to give shape to what lurked just beyond. The captain stood upon the command deck, his eyes locked upon the hololithic display of the Galar field status. Pale green runes flickered with unsettling irregularity, as if mocking the certainty of his prayers. The navigator, cloaked in the shrouded garments of her order, sat frozen in her throne, her third eye turned inward, guiding the vessel along the unseen tides. Beads of sweat dripped from her brow, though her body did not move. She was a statue carved from agony, bearing the weight of 1 billion screaming voices that clawed at her mind. Servitors twitched where they stood, their augmetic limbs shuddering, as unseen interference bled into their circuits. One collapsed with a hollow thud, its mechanical limbs seizing, repeating the same broken line of Binhara code until it was dragged away by its fellows. The deck officers exchanged glances, but said nothing. What words could they offer? They all knew. A failing machine was nothing compared to the thought of a failing Galar field. Then the lights dimmed, just for a moment, but it was enough. The entire ship seemed to draw a breath. Some screamed, others fell silent, clutching rosaries of bone or stamped metal aquilas to their lips. The captain barked orders, though his voice carried a strain that betrayed him. The Galar field flickered, its protective dome rippling against the unseen claws that raked at it from beyond. For a heartbeat, the veil thinned.
The navigator let out a single ragged cry, and then silence fell across the bridge. Not the silence of calm, but the suffocating kind. The silence that comes before something breaks. In that silence, faint whispers bled through the steel walls, brushing against the ears of the living. The words could not be understood, yet they clawed into the mind, digging at old wounds, offering half-forgotten promises. Some crew wept openly, some laughed, some pressed their heads to the floor and begged for the Emperor's gaze to fall upon them. Deep in the holds, the child whimpered again, but this time the mother could not shush him. For her own voice was lost, her lips trembling, her eyes rolling back as if she were seeing a vision. Those nearby turned from her, too afraid to ask what she had seen. One man muttered, "The veil thins." Another spat blood and whispered a prayer through cracked lips. The captain's hand hovered over the command lectern, his knuckles white. He wanted to order the ship to turn, to flee, though there was nowhere to flee to. The warp offered no refuge, only different shades of madness. He swallowed, forced the words from his throat, and commanded the crew to strengthen their prayers, to raise their voices as one. The choir of astropaths joined then, their hollow sockets raised, their thin bodies quaking as they chanted in unison, their voices a bridge of sound thrown into the abyss. The ship groaned in reply, the hull bending as if beneath some immeasurable weight. The lights flickered again, but this time they did not fail. The Geller field pulsed, a golden shimmer visible even on the view screens, and the unseen claws recoiled. For now. Relief swept the deck like a wave. But it was not joy, only exhaustion. Only the temporary reprieve of those who knew this storm would return. The captain exhaled. He thought of Terra, though he had never seen it. He thought of the Emperor, golden and unmoving, whose will still burned across the galaxy. He whispered a prayer, not of thanks, but of fear. And the ship sailed onward, deeper into the fractured veil, where the warp waited, patient as ever. The hours dragged, though in the warp hours had little meaning. Time became elastic, folding in on itself, stretching thin until memory and present bled into one indistinguishable haze. The crew kept to their duties, but their motions had the hollow rhythm of ritual rather than purpose, as though they feared that stopping for even a heartbeat would invite the gaze of something waiting just beyond the veil. In the chapel, incense smoke curled in thick black plumes, heavy with the scent of burned oils and promethium. Hundreds knelt shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering icon of the imperial Aquila, their voices hoarse from chanting litanies. The priest's voice cracked as he roared the same verses over and over, each word less a sermon than a shield, as though sound itself could keep the warp at bay. The crew repeated him not because they believed it would work, but because silence would have been worse. In silence, one could hear the scratching at the edges of thought. Far below, in the manufactorum decks, the machine spirits of the engines stirred uneasily. Tech priests anointed conduits with sacred oils, their mechadendrites moving in jerks and spasms as if guided by something unseen. Data slates glowed with shifting script, binaric code unraveling into strange shapes that resembled no known tongue. One adept's Volksgrill stuttered, uttering a word no one had taught him, a word that even the servitors paused in their mindless work. He immediately slammed his forehead into the deck plating until his cranial augmetic cracked, whispering prayers to drown out what had passed through him. None helped him, for all knew such contamination was contagious, and compassion was weakness in the face of corruption.
In the void outside, there was no starlight, no horizon, only the storm. The warp rolled like an ocean of molten glass, color shifting too violently for mortal eyes to name. Great shadows drifted within it, some with shapes that suggested wings, others with forms too vast to comprehend. They pressed closer when the Gellerfield trembled, recoiling when it surged, circling the vessel like carrion birds, waiting for a beast to stumble. The sight of them drove men to madness, so shutters were drawn tight across observation ports, but the pressure of their attention remained, crawling beneath the skin like a fever. A navigator's apprentice, tasked with recording the vessel's passage, clawed at his own throat until the flesh gave way. His last words were not his own, spoken in a tongue older than the Imperium, though every man present swore they heard them clearly. None repeated the phrase, though it lingered in their minds, gnawing, echoing. His body was cast into the recycler without rights, for the crew feared that even a corpse might still whisper if left too long. On the bridge, the captain leaned over the lectern again, though his shoulders had grown heavier since the last flicker. His eyes, once sharp and unyielding, now carried the hollow sheen of a man who knew that victory against the warp was only ever survival, never triumph. He watched his navigator twitch in her throne, her shrouded face beaded with sweat, and wondered if her third eye had seen what waited outside the field. He did not ask. No navigator would speak of such visions. To name them was to invite them closer. Suddenly, the Vox crackled alive, voices shrieking across the channels. It was not the sound of distress calls or orders, but of laughter, high, piercing, mechanical and human at once. The bridge froze. The captain slammed the Vox shut, but the sound continued, rattling through the steel as though the ship itself had begun to mock them. A junior officer fell to his knees, blood running from his ears, his eyes rolling back. The laughter ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the hum of the engines and the rasp of shaken breaths. The priest arrived not long after, his robes reeking of incense, his lips blistered from too many prayers. He anointed the command lectern with sacred oils, pressing his bleeding thumb against the runes, whispering benedictions to seal them against intrusion. The captain said nothing, but not at once. They both knew such rites were desperate gestures, but sometimes desperation was all that kept men sane. Below deck, the child cried once more, though this time the sound carried. It spread through the hold like a thread, each man and woman's ears pricked by it. No one hushed him. Instead, they listened, transfixed, until they realized the sound no longer belonged to the child. It deepened, warped, became 2 voices, then 10, then a chorus. The mother clutched her son tight, rocking back and forth, eyes wide with terror. The others closed their eyes, prayed harder, or covered their ears with bloodied palms. None dared to search for the source, because deep down they feared that if they looked, they would see the warp staring back at them from the hollow sockets of their neighbors' eyes. The veil fractured again, and the ship groaned as though its very soul were caught between teeth. The veil tore like a wound in the dark, and though the Gellerfield still burned, its shimmer had thinned to a fragile membrane of gold. The crew felt it all at once, a pressure in the lungs, a heaviness behind the eyes, as though their very thoughts were being pulled outward, dragged into the storm. Men clutched their skulls, screaming prayers to the emperor, while others fell silent, their mouths open in awe as visions bled across their minds. For some, it was memory, a lost mother's face, smiling as though alive again. A battlefield where a brother still breathed, a world drowned in sunlight that no longer existed. The warp preyed upon these illusions, tender and cruel, weaving hope into chains. For others, it was terror unmasked, teeth in the dark, wings stretched across impossible skies, cities that bent and breathed like living things. No one saw the same vision, yet all felt the same truth, that reality itself was thinning, and something pressed close enough to taste their fear. The navigator screamed, a sound that cut through steel,
and her shrouded form spasmed as her third eye opened wide to gaze upon the storm. What she saw, none could know, but her cry carried the weight of countless voices, as if she had become a mouthpiece for the abyss. The captain gripped the lectern until his nails split, willing himself not to flinch. To falter here would mean death, to give in would mean worse. The astropaths bled as one, crimson rivers running from their eyeless sockets, yet their voices rose higher, carried on a tide of agony. They did not stop. Their song was jagged and broken, but in its discord there was strength. They sang the Emperor's name, not as a plea, but as a wall, each syllable hammered into the warp like iron. The ship itself seemed to steady, its hull resonating with their cries. Still, the laughter returned. Not over the Vox, but within the bones of the ship itself. It rose from the bulkheads, the decks, the very breath of recycled air. The sound was vast and intimate, surrounding them from every angle, yet whispering in each ear, as if it knew their secret fears. Men tore at their ears to block it out, but it was not a sound one could escape. It was the warp, speaking in mockery, in promise, in hunger. Then the child's voice rose above it, not crying this time, but speaking. His small throat shaped words in a language that twisted the mind, syllables not meant for mortal mouths. His mother held him tight, rocking, sobbing, yet the boy's eyes glowed faintly as if some hidden ember had been lit within. The surrounding crew recoiled, their fear now directed at the boy rather than the storm. None dared to act, but all knew the truth. Corruption had already found its way inside. The captain called for the priest. With trembling hands, the priest drew his blade of sanctified steel and approached, chanting a litany meant to sever the tie. But before he reached the child, the warp recoiled, the ship shuddered, the Gellerfield surged with golden fire, and the laughter was drowned in a shriek that seemed to tear across the void itself. The veil had not broken. Not yet. Light returned to the corridors, harsh and artificial, but steady. The navigator slumped in her throne, breathing ragged, her third eye closed. The astropaths collapsed one by one, their song finished, their bodies trembling but alive. The crew whispered thanks between gasps of fear, clutching their aquillas, kissing the deck, weeping openly. They had endured another passage through the storm, though all knew it was not the last. The boy no longer spoke, his voice his own again, though his eyes remained clouded, unfocused, as if part of him had been left behind. His mother wept quietly, refusing to release him. The priest hesitated, blade still in hand, but sheathed it at the captain's command. Judgment would come later, when the storm had passed. Survival came first. Always survival. The ship sailed on, its engines pushing against the tide of unreality, each second a knife's edge between deliverance and damnation. In the silence that followed, no one celebrated. They knew what they had seen, even if they would never speak it aloud. The veil was fractured, and the warp had pressed its face to theirs.
The captain stared into the hololith, where the green runes of the Gellerfield burned steady once more. He allowed himself a single thought, brief and dangerous, that perhaps faith was not enough. And then, with that thought buried deep, he whispered the Emperor's name, and the ship continued into darkness. It began not with screams, but with silence. A silence that stretched too long, heavy as lead, filling the void ship like smoke. After the veil had steadied and the Gellerfield resumed its rhythm, one might have expected relief to bloom, however brittle. Instead, the quiet pressed upon every mind, a reminder that the warp did not relent so much as wait. Men and women moved through the corridors with their heads lowered, speaking only in whispers, as though any louder sound might draw attention from beyond the hull. Yet even in hushed tones, something else lingered beneath their voices, echoes that did not belong. A helmsman muttered coordinates under his breath, only to falter when he realized the words were not his own. A serf recited a prayer to the emperor, and in its final line, a new phrase appeared, slipping past his lips before he could swallow it back. He crossed himself a dozen times afterward, but the chill in his marrow never left. The warp had not receded, it had seeped in. In the mess hall, men gathered to share rations of recycle paste, though no one tasted it. They chewed mechanically, eyes darting toward one another with suspicion. Conversation flickered in short bursts, but always ended abruptly when someone swore they heard a voice behind them. More than one crewman rose with fury, accusing his comrades of mockery, only to falter when he realized the voice had not come from any mouth present. Quarrels ended not in blows, but in trembling silence. It was worse than fighting. The Skitarii were the first to falter. Augmetics designed to filter noise and intrusion began to twitch with corrupted signals. Their mechanical limbs convulsing as binharic streams filled their auditory relays. At first it was static, bursts of sound like distant thunder. Then the static formed patterns, phrases, orders. Some stood rigid for hours, motionless, their crimson optics glowing faintly as though they gazed at something just beyond sight. Tech priests scrambled to recalibrate their implants, yet many whispered that it was not error but infection, that the warp had found a way into the machine spirit itself. The thought was heresy, but heresy had long ceased to be a stranger on this vessel. One Skitarius tore his own vox unit from his throat with a mechanical claw, shrieking words that were not his own. Sparks showered his armor as he fell twitching to the deck, servos grinding in unnatural rhythm. His final sound was a laugh, hollow and metallic, that echoed even after he had fallen silent. The priests dragged the husk away, chanting binharic litanies, but the laughter clung to the air like smoke. No one doubted others would follow. And then came the dreams. At first they struck the officers, whose quarters offered no protection against the pressure gnawing at the mind. A lieutenant awoke screaming, clawing at his own chest, convinced something was burrowing through his ribs. He lived, though his eyes stared endlessly into corners where nothing stood. Another officer staggered from his chamber with blood dripping from his palms, whispering that the emperor had spoken to him in flame, promising absolution through surrender. He begged to be bound before his words could tempt others, and so they chained him to his bunk, his lips still moving long after gag and prayer sealed them shut.
The lower decks fared worse. Hundreds of crewmen tossed and writhed upon their pallets, their voices rising together in a storm of nightmares. Some spoke of loved ones calling them through the walls. Others whispered of doors opening where no doors should be. The warp was not simply haunting them, it was bleeding into their very sleep, planting seeds that would flower into terror long after the voyage ended. The priest walked among them with censer swinging, the thick incense a futile barrier against corruption. He pressed his aquila to sweating brows, whispering benedictions into ears that had already begun to mutter back to him. Not prayers, not words of comfort, but questions, insidious and soft. Why do you serve a throne of bone? Why kneel to a corpse who cannot speak? His hand trembled as he drew the sign of the aquila, for even he felt the whisper coiling beneath his tongue. On the bridge, the captain watched the reports pile higher, his jaw tight, his knuckles bruised from striking the lectern in helpless fury. He ordered discipline, demanded silence, forbade any mention of voices, but orders could not command thought. Rumors spread faster than air. They said the warp had marked them, that the Geller field did not protect so much as paint a target. They said the Emperor's light had grown thin, and that only the whispers offered truth. The navigator sat in her throne, her shrouded form still, her third eye closed, yet her lips moved in soundless rhythm. The captain dared not ask what she heard, for fear that she might answer. And so the whispers grew. The second part of Chapter 2 unfolds beneath the steady throb of the plasma drives, a heartbeat too slow to feel alive and too constant to feel safe. The mess hall's echoes faded into the companionways where condensation beaded on pipes like cold sweat, and every junction box hummed with an undertone that did not belong to the engines. Crew shuffled in pairs now, never alone, yet loneliness clung to them all the same. A quartermaster paused at a hatch to the cargo galleries and swore he heard someone say his name from the other side. He opened it to darkness and stacked crates, to the dry tang of recycled air and dust. Then, again, his name, at the back of the tongue, spoken from behind his teeth. He shut the hatch so hard the seals squealed and whispered 3 litanies to the Emperor before he trusted his legs to move. In the manufactorum bays, the machine choirs attempted a cleansing rite, a cadence of pure tones meant to drown the impurity of stray signal. The hymn began crystalline, a perfect ladder of sound climbing toward blessed silence. But midway through, an extra note inserted itself, thin as a hair and sharp as wire. It wove into the chant, hid inside it, wore the rite as a skin. Tech priests adjusted servos and recalibrated cogitators, sparks spitting from ferric fingertips, but each correction birthed a new dissonance 3 registers lower, as if the song itself had grown roots in the deck and would not be uprooted. A red-robed adept froze, augmetic eyelids shivering, then rotated his head 1 degree too far for flesh. His vox grill grated a syllable that smelled like rot and warm copper, and the junior engine seers backed away, pressing sanctified seals onto their own breastplates like children hiding behind masks. On the gun decks, ratings scraped sacred oils over macro-barrel housings and traced the Imperial Aquila where paint had blistered from heat. They talked of munitions and recoil dampers, as if speaking the language of steel could anchor them to reality. When the far void siren hiccuped, only a single stutter, their hands trembled as one organism. "It's nothing," said a petty officer. He repeated it twice more, each repetition punctured by a silence in which something almost answered.
The priest found the captain in the tactical shrine adjoining the bridge. The room smelled of incense and old leather, a geometry of reliquaries and battle hollows casting bruised light across the deck. Neither man removed his gaze from the hololithic projection of the Gellerfield's harmonics. Both watched the same wavering crest as if it might be persuaded to steady under scrutiny. "They are hearing confessions that were never made," the priest murmured, his voice a rasp ground down by too many rites. "Memories without owners, questions without questioners." The captain's jaw tightened. If he closed his eyes, he could count the cadences of shipboard prayers from childhood catechisms, could set them like rivets into his skull and hang his thoughts upon them. He did not close his eyes. "We will keep to doctrine," he said. "Discipline is doctrine made visible." The priest inclined his head as if that were a benediction and not a plea. In the crew holds, the boy slept with his mother's arm around him, his breath shallow, eyelids flickering in rhythms no one could match to the passing seconds. A medicus checked his pulse and found 2 beats for every one, offset like twin currents colliding. "Fever," he lied to the mother, because a fever could be cooled with water in time, and because she needed a word that did not wear teeth. At the aisle across, a voidsman woke to find a small wet handprint pressed to his chest. He had no children.
He wiped it away and found the imprint mirrored on his palm, as if traded for a debt. Reports bled together. A Vox operator insisted that a transmission had arrived from a sister ship lost 3 centuries prior, its call sign unmistakable, its captain requesting docking clearance in a cheerful tone that did not belong to a man who had died before the operator's grandparents were born. The log recorded only static. In the astropathic choir, one thin figure rose and began to smile at the wall, a smile that widened and widened until the skin cracked, blood threading down to his chin. He sang the name of a world none had charted, a syllabic geometry like knives laid out for a ritual, and stopped only when his voice abandoned him in a dry, relieved sigh. The whispers learned them. That was the worst of it. At first they were foreign, unclean cadences, baited hooks of promise and derision. By the 3rd shift they had adopted the crew's dialect, their idioms, the quiet humor of men and women who knew the bite of lanyards and the taste of coolant. They apologized, these voices. They begged forgiveness for small slights never committed, then offered secrets no one should know. A woman heard the exact number of ration tins her brother had stolen during a famine 20 years gone, the number she had never dared guess. A gunner's mate learned the final words of the comrade he had abandoned on a boarding run when a bulkhead sealed too quickly. These were truths, or perfect imitations of truth, and truth has a flavor men will swallow even when it cuts. Discipline bent. A sergeant offered his squad a choice: either submit to blindfolded patrols or face a day confined to bunks with nothing but mem-psalms. They chose the blindfolds. Better darkness than the sight of things glimpsed from the corners. Better to map the corridors by knuckles and boot noses than watch a hatch breathe. Boots tapped out new cartographies. Hands met familiar grates and blessed them with fingerprints as if making pacts with the hull. Near the navigator's sanctum, the air changed, cooler, thinner, tinged with the metallic sweetness of recycled blood. The captain stood at the threshold and felt the ship tilt on an axis his inner ear did not know. The navigator's attendants watched him without watching him, faces veiled, pupils dilated, until the irises were rings of night. From within came a sound like rain falling sideways. He asked nothing and entered. The navigator sat rigid, her shroud stippled with salt where sweat had dried. Her lips moved, just enough to prove life. "The current is learning us," she breathed. Barely air, no more than a thought exhaled. "We have become a path it remembers." The captain did what officers do when language fails. He arranged his hands at parade rest and made a shape of authority. "Can you hold us to the light?" he asked. She did not nod. Her shoulders softened, a withdrawal from some abyssal edge. And he accepted that as assent because there was no other word to choose.
On the lower maintenance rings, a work gang found a door where no door had been. A rectangle of brushed steel, flush with the bulkhead, framed by rivets that matched none of their schematics. No hinges, no panel, just a seam thin as a thought. They stepped back in unison, then forward as if pulled by a common string. One of them, young, too new to have learned how to be old, pressed his palm to the metal. It was warm. He said he felt a heartbeat. He lied. It was his own. The door opened inward without sound, revealing a corridor of familiar width running into a darkness that reflected no light. They stood there and watched their breath drift inside and fail to return. Then they backed away, 1 foot at a time, and sealed the hatch with 4 separate sanctified locks that had not existed 10 minutes earlier. The seam persisted in memory more than in metal, a bruise along the wall where thought had been tested for weakness. When the siren finally called for general devotion, the crew flooded the chapel as if the decks themselves had tipped them inside. The priest raised the Aquila, and for a rare moment the whispers receded to the perimeter like feral things dragged by chains. The hymn swelled, ragged but unanimous, a chorus soldered from terror and breath and the stubbornness of those who must live long enough to regret it. The captain entered last and took no special place. He knelt among his people and mouthed the litany, tasting copper and old smoke, and when the final response came, his light in darkness, the word light felt like a hinge holding a door that should not open. Somewhere deep in the superstructure, a bell tolled that no one had installed. It rang once, and the note did not fade so much as walk away down a corridor none of them would ever find. The crew did not ask what it marked. They listened to silence reassemble itself around them, and in the makeshift safety of that earned quiet, the navigator exhaled. For a heartbeat, the ship felt almost real. By the fourth cycle, sleep had become treacherous. To close the eyes was to open a door, and the warp was waiting just beyond it. Crew dozed only in fragments, jerking awake at phantom touches or the sound of someone whispering their name inches from their ear. Yet when they looked, no one was near. In the stillness of half-dream, shadows thickened, and men swore they felt the brush of fingers dragging across their skin. The priest ordered vigils through the corridors, squads of the faithful pacing with censers that belched smoke so thick the metal walls turned black. The air choked lungs, but the stench of incense was better than the sweetness of rot that sometimes lingered when the lights dimmed. In the haze, the whispers lost their clarity, as if distance had been forced between the crew and the voices. But incense could not be burned forever. Fuel was finite. Faith was finite. An engine seer reported that the ship's cogitators were answering queries that had not been asked. Lines of Benharic code flickered across data slates, in the dead hours recursive phrases that translated to nothing or worse, to fragments of prophecy. One displayed a time and a name. When that hour arrived, the named crewman collapsed in the corridor, his skull fractured against the deck as though an invisible hand had struck him. The tech priests smashed the data slate and anointed its fragments with oils. But more screens lit the same way the following night, and more names appeared. Some begged to be placed under guard. Others tried to flee, only to be found hours later speaking to walls that pulsed with the heat of breath. On the bridge, the navigator still sat in silence, but her attendants said her lips never ceased moving. They whispered that she was bargaining, not guiding, not resisting, but bargaining with the storm that pressed against them. Whether such words were true or only rumor made flesh by fear, none dared to say. The captain knew only this. The path through the warp still lay ahead, and the whispers grew bolder with each step. In the crew holds, paranoia became as dangerous as the warp itself. A woman swore her bunkmate's eyes glowed when he slept. Men claimed their comrades' voices shifted, sometimes deeper, sometimes doubled, as if two throats spoke at once. A brawl erupted when one crewman accused another of echoing the laugh they had all heard days before. Blood slicked the floor before officers broke them apart, and still no one could prove what they thought they'd seen. Fear became its own contagion.
And through it all, the boy's silence grew heavier. He no longer cried, he no longer spoke. His mother fed him with trembling hands, his lips chewing without will, his eyes always open, staring somewhere just beyond the walls. Some avoided that corner of the hold entirely, afraid that if they met his gaze too long, they might hear the whispers more clearly. The priest passed by once, laid a hand on the boy's head, and snatched it back, as though burned. He said nothing, but his knuckles were white around the aquila when he left. The ship had survived the fracture of the veil, but it was no longer whole. Something had seeped inside. Not talons, not claws, but words. Gentle as breath, sharp as glass, inevitable as tide. And the whispers had only just begun. Faith on a void ship is not optional. It is the marrow of survival, as necessary as rations or oxygen. Without it, the warp would seep into every corner, a flood against which no bulkhead could hold. Yet faith is a fragile shield, and when tested too long, it begins to warp like metal in a furnace. In the lower decks, the ministerium priest walked among the huddled masses with his censer burning hot, its smoke curling like black serpents into the air.
His voice rasped with exhaustion, but still he chanted the litanies of endurance, forcing the syllables through cracked lips. Men and women repeated him in broken echoes, some with fervor, some with empty mouths moving only out of habit. The boy stared blankly, his mother mouthing the words around him as though her faith could cover them both. For a time, the ritual steadied them. The crew clung to the rhythm of the verses, their voices rising together like rivets hammered into a wall. But the warp is patient. Its whispers coiled beneath the chant, subtle at first, then louder. A man faltered mid-verse, finishing with a phrase that did not belong. Another knelt so hard his knees bled, muttering prayers to a name none recognized. The priest struck him down with a swift blow of his staff, bellowing that heresy would not be tolerated, even in weakness. The crowd shrank back, fearful of him, fearful of the silence that followed. Above, in the officers' chapel, the prayers were different. The officers prayed for duty, for loyalty, for discipline that would outlast fear. Their ministorium preacher stood clad in embroidered robes, his voice smoother, his words measured. He spoke of the emperor's will as steel, of sacrifice as the only true coin. Yet even here, the warp intruded. One officer wept as he prayed, confessing that he no longer dreamed of Terra's light, but of a golden throne cracking apart, spilling ash into the void. The priest laid hands upon him, reciting the rite of purity until the officer stilled, though his eyes were those of a man already lost. Faith kept the ship from tearing itself apart, but every act of faith carried weight. In the manufactorium, crews bled themselves willingly, offering drops of blood to anoint the conduits before ignition. Some whispered the emperor demanded it. Others whispered the omnitia required appeasement. No one questioned the contradiction. They gave what was asked, and the engines obeyed. For now. On the gun decks, crews carved aquillas into their own flesh, shallow cuts across arms and shoulders, each mark a promise that they would fire true should the veil break again. They bound the wounds with rags dipped in machine oil, believing that mingling their blood with the lifeblood of the vessel would weld them to its fate. Disciplined officers looked away, better to have zealots than cowards when the claws came pressing. The captain saw the change most clearly. His crew no longer moved with obedience, but with desperation, masquerading as zeal. They shouted prayers louder than orders, obeyed liturgies faster than commands. He knew what this meant. Faith had become fuel, and fuel always burns out. He thought of the astropaths, their sockets still red with dried blood, their lips moving in endless hymns though no choir master had told them to sing. He thought of the navigator, silent but for the faint movements of her mouth, bargaining still, perhaps, not with gods, but with the dark between them.
He wondered what price had already been paid, and whether they would know when it came due. The priest's voice wore down to a grit that scraped the ear, but his rites multiplied. He divided the ship into hours of devotion and hours of labor, braided together so tightly that no one could slip between them into thought. When exhaustion toppled men onto their pallets before the benediction, he ordered them roused and marched to the chapel barefoot, to feel the cold of the deck and remember that faith without pain was only posture. Some cursed him under their breath and kissed the Aquila a moment later. Others watched him pass with eyes bright as fever, as if he were a torch they meant to carry until their hands charred. The manufactorum decks grew loud with prayer hum, the drone of 1,000 throats synchronized to the pulse of the engines. Each ignition sequence now ended with a shared inhalation, each shutdown with a collective exhale, as if the vessel itself were a chest to be breathed for by the faithful. An engine seer placed a reliquary nail, said to be forged on Mars during a forgotten crusade, into the primary conduit housing and sealed it with sanctified resin. The cogitator's harmonic steadied. Word of the miracle ran hot through the gantries. Within a shift, lesser relics sprouted along pipes and junctions. Knotted prayer cords, stamped tin aquillas, tears gathered in vials and labeled with names. The tech priests did not approve, but neither did they remove them. If belief coaxed compliance from machine spirits, it was a heresy they could inventory. On the gun decks, zeal took the shape of wagers with fate. Crewmen volunteered for double watches, then triple, insisting that wakefulness was a tithe the Emperor would accept in exchange for a quiet passage. Lips split, eyes bled along the rims, hands shook over the consecrated mechanisms of recoil and feed. A petty officer who had once mocked sermons now led a circle in the shadow behind the macro batteries. They traced sabbatical signs with used shell chalk, whispered a vow to fire at anything that dared resolve from the warp's churn, even if it wore a familiar transponder. The captain ordered that talk put down. The petty officer saluted, eyes shining with an obedience that bordered on ecstasy, and said the vow could be amended to include only impossible silhouettes. The compromise, like most aboard, was a prayer shaped into policy. Rumor ran faster than order. The astropathic choir, it was said, had begun to tithe their own memories, setting favorite hours, birthdays, shore leaves, the exact taste of citrus from a market on a port world, upon the altar of the Emperor's name. The choir master denied it, and then, inadvertently, proved it by forgetting the denial halfway through a sentence. In the holds, a mother traded her rations of sweetness for 3 extra candles, lit them before sleep, and promised to let them burn to stubs, even if flames starved the air. The boy beside her did not watch the candles. He watched their smoke. When the priest knelt and pressed the aquila to his brow a second time, the boy's skin was cool as a coin. Discipline swerved where faith surged. 2 deckhands accused a third of speaking a litany backward in his sleep. The third swore the words were honest, that he had learned them so by the rote of fright. The sergeant punished all 3, lashing them with a length of cable until their skins welted like ropework, then ordered them to stand watch together, to braid their pain into a single line that could be pulled without slack. They obeyed, and when a whisper drifted along the corridor an hour later, they gripped the cable between them and hauled until their palms tore, as if they could drag the sound into the open, where fists might settle it. The whisper receded, not defeated, but bored. The men wept, and then laughed, and then prayed for forgiveness for laughing. The captain's sleep became a ledger of bargains. He dreamed of a corridor where doors stood ajar, and inside each room a different version of himself kneeled. One with blood on his hands, one with ash on his tongue, one with a voice he no longer owned. In waking, he studied the navigator's vitals and the Jellerfield's pulse, dared a visit to the choir to thank them for another steady hour, and found his words caught in his throat. What coin could he offer that had not been spent? He thought of the ship's reserve rations of oxygen, of the sacred prohibition against waste, and of the long-ago story of a captain who had vented a cursed deck to the void to silence a chorus of voices that had learned the crew's names. It was a story told as warning and as boast. He did not tell it aloud. He carried it down the length of the bridge like a weight that might shift and crush the wrong foot.
In the officers' chapel, the preacher adjusted his homily to the tenor of the ship. He spoke less of the Emperor's distant light and more of the warmth that could be forged among men who refused to yield. He called this warmth an echo of terra, and some dared to close their eyes when he said the word, as if they could feel sunlight against closed lids. One officer interrupted to ask what the Emperor required beyond prayer. The preacher answered with the old litany: labor, obedience, perseverance, and then, unbidden, added a 4th word that surprised even him: renunciation. He let it stand. The next day, 3 officers surrendered keepsakes: a locket, a data slate of family images not viewed in years, a strip of silk from a wedding cuff. The preacher accepted them and locked them in a reliquary box before the altar. The owner of the locket slept without dreaming for the first time in a week. Price accrued inquire ledgers, too. A machinist who scoffed at devotions found his tools returned sharper after he left a slice of bread at the base of a humming conduit. He laughed, and the laughter tasted of relief, and the next day he left a piece of fruit that he did not have. A voidsman with a stammer found his voice smooth when he recited the canticles before speaking orders. Later, when he spoke to a friend without them and stumbled again, he wept and begged the Aquila's forgiveness for presuming to talk like a man. Faith was mending and breaking in the same motion, splinting bones in positions that might never straighten. The boy woke in the false night of the lower decks and turned his face toward the faint vibration that ran through the hull. "It's counting," he said softly, to no one and to everyone. His mother shushed him with a gentleness so frayed it could barely hold. Around them, a handful of sleepers stirred. No one asked what it counted. They listened to the thrum and told themselves it was only the engines keeping time. When the alarm sounded, a clean, narrow tone that belonged to no prior drill, the chapel emptied in practiced cascades, feet already knowing where to run. On the bridge, the captain read the script of amber runes blooming across the hololith, and felt that inward tilt again, the ship leaning toward a choice. A breach warning flickered and stabilized, a ghost in the circuits, or a future arriving early. He looked at the priest who had somehow arrived without being summoned, censer dark, Aquila bright, eyes raw. Between them stood every rite, every bargain, every sacrifice that had not yet been named. The breach warning never blossomed into rupture, but its echo lingered in every mind like a tolling bell. Afterward, faith became fever. The crew, once disciplined in their rites, now threw themselves into devotion with a ferocity that frightened even the priest. Men cut deeper wounds into their flesh to carve Aquilas. Women knelt until their knees cracked and bled. Officers led chants that lasted through entire shifts until voices rasped into silence. They clung to ritual as though the warp itself could be driven back by noise and blood. Yet faith, when carried to excess, frays into something unrecognizable. A rating refused to eat, claiming the emperor had ordered his fast to purify the decks. When forced to take sustenance, he vomited and prayed over his own sickness. Another scrawled pages of liturgies across the steel bulkheads in his own blood, convinced that written prayers bound the warp tighter than spoken ones. The captain ordered the walls scrubbed clean, but no matter how many times they were scoured, faint stains remained, spelling words that could not quite be erased. The priest himself began to unravel beneath the burden. His sermons shifted from reassurance to thunder, each word laced with fury. He bellowed that doubt was sin, that the whispers were proof of weakness, that those who faltered would be cast into the void. His eyes burned with a fanatic light that unsettled even his acolytes. To the desperate, his fire was strength. To others, it was madness. The line blurred until none could tell the difference.
The captain understood what was happening, though he dared not name it. Faith was no longer shield, it was knife, pointed inward. He saw his men turn against one another not because of heresy, but because of suspicion of it. A woman accused her bunkmate of smiling at the wrong moment during a hymn, and the crew tore him apart with fists and boots before the officers arrived. They said the emperor demanded it. They said the ship was safer for it. But afterward,
When silence returned, they all felt the guilt like acid on their tongues. The astropaths continued their endless chanting, but their voices grew stranger. Their hymns stretched into dissonant shapes, less like worship and more like warning. Some claimed the choir no longer sang to the emperor, but to something in the dark. No one confronted them, for without the astropaths, the ship would be blind and deaf, drifting into eternity. It was better not to know, better not to listen too closely, better to believe their cracked voices still carried the emperor's name. And always the boy lingered. He ate, he drank, he breathed, but his silence deepened into something otherworldly. When others prayed, he sat still, his eyes fixed on the bulkheads as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. His mother still clutched him close, still whispered litanies into his ear, but her lips trembled and her prayers stumbled as though she knew the truth she would never speak. The priest watched him once, from a distance, and gripped his Aquila so hard his knuckles bled. The price of faith was being paid in blood, in fear, in the quiet surrender of reason. It bound the crew together and it pulled them apart. It shielded them and it wounded them. It kept the warp at bay, and yet the warp had never been closer. The captain stood upon the bridge, staring into the hololith, and thought, not for the first time, that faith might not be enough. Yet he had nothing else to give, and so he whispered the emperor's name, the same name that now echoed in both hymns and whisper, and prayed that his crew could survive the debt they were already drowning in. Rumors are the Imperium's second lifeblood. On every void ship, on every station, in every manufactorium, they slither through corridors faster than light itself. When the veil fractures and the warp presses close, rumor becomes more than idle talk. It becomes survival. And survival, in such places, is indistinguishable from faith. The whispers had eaten their way into thought and prayer, but now they began to wear new masks. The crew spoke of guardians who lingered at the edges of perception, beings unseen, yet not entirely absent. Some said the Adeptus Custodes themselves could extend their golden vigil beyond Terra, their spears gleaming in the immaterium to hold back demons. Others swore that fragments of the Emperor's will drifted like shards through the warp, splinters of his eternal fire, watching from behind the veil. Whether these tales were born of desperation or divine truth, none dared to say aloud. But in the void between heartbeat and silence, men believed. The navigator fueled these whispers more than she silenced them. Wrapped in her veil, she had become gaunt, her lips cracked from ceaseless murmurs. The attendant swore that she was no longer guiding alone, but communing, that she spoke not to the storm, but to something within it. One acolyte swore he heard her whispering names, names not listed on the ship's roster, names that sent shivers down the spine when repeated. Another swore her third eye had remained open for days, glowing faintly even in sleep. Both stories spread like fire, each one bending into myth as it passed from mouth to mouth.
And with each tale, the idea grew. There were gatekeepers in the warp. Perhaps not flesh, perhaps not divine, but watchers all the same. Some painted them as loyal angels of the Emperor, radiant and tireless, barring the demonic hordes from slipping past. Others muttered that they were prisoners, chained to guard the threshold not out of love, but of penance. Shadows of psychers burned too brightly and bound forever. A darker tale whispered that the Watchers were not servants of the throne at all, but predators circling a bleeding beast, guardians only in the sense that carrion guards its meal. The priest did not like these tales, but even he could not kill them. He thundered sermons about heresy, warning that to believe in other saviors was to spit upon the Emperor's light. Yet even as he spoke,
His eyes drifted to the hololith, where green runes shimmered with uncertain steadiness, and he wondered what hands truly steadied them. His sermons grew louder, his staff struck harder, but the more he forbade the rumor, the more it spread. In the holds, men traced the outlines of phantom figures they claimed to glimpse in the corner of their vision, towering silhouettes of armor too immense to be mortal. Women said they dreamed of golden helms gleaming beneath unseen suns, of gauntleted hands pulling them back from the edge of a tide. One man swore he had heard a custodian's voice echo in the chapel during a hymn, low and resonant, guiding the words when the priest faltered. He could not prove it, but he was believed. Belief was stronger than truth. The astropaths whispered differently. Their sockets bled, their song faltered, and in the silence between verses they spoke of chains, not guardians. They said the watchers were bound not by loyalty, but by compulsion, caught between warp and real space, their eyes hollow with duty that was not chosen. They whispered of gates that were not gates at all, but wounds in reality stitched shut only by the agony of those nailed across them. These words spread too, in hushed tones, poisoning faith with doubt. The captain heard all of it. He kept his silence, but his heart bent beneath the weight. His men prayed to the emperor, but they also prayed to shadows, to guardians they had never seen, to voices they could not name. And he knew what that meant. Their faith was dividing. Divided faith is brittle. Brittle faith shatters. Still, in the quiet of the bridge, when the hololith flickered and the veil strained, even the captain dared a thought he would never voice, that perhaps beyond the veil there truly were gatekeepers, and that without them the ship would already be gone. The rumor of gatekeepers ripened into liturgy before anyone could name the moment it crossed that threshold. Men began to pause at junctions where the ship's hum dipped a note, touching the bulkhead as if pressing palms to an unseen reliquary. A grease-stained rating in the manufactorum claimed that when his spanner slipped and should have shattered his wrist, a pressure, neither cold nor warm, only immense, caught the tool mid-fall and set it gently upon the deck. He told the story in a whisper that made the hair rise along forearms, and the story put down roots. By the end of the cycle, a handful of workers knelt beside that conduit before each ignition and recited a plain-spoken thanks to the nameless watcher who they insisted walked the catwalks with them. Other stories wore sharper edges. A voidsman returning from the observation blister claimed he had glimpsed a figure on the far side of the Gellerschimmer, motionless as a statue, shoulders like a fortress wall, spear held at rest. The figure did not advance or retreat. It regarded the ship with an attention that felt like judgment. He described the sense that his soul had been weighed and found light enough to pass. The priest called it blasphemy dressed as comfort and ordered the blister sealed, but welds mean little to memory. The tale spread anyway, growing a helm, then laurels, then the suggestion of a crimson cloak that fluttered in a wind that could not exist in vacuum.
The navigator's attendants began leaving small offerings at the threshold of her sanctum. A sliver of gold wire twisted into a crude aquila, a strip of parchment inked with the creed, 3 drops of secret oil beaded upon a bolt. The captain noticed and did not forbid them. He had once believed offerings belonged only at sanctioned altars. Now he understood that men built altars wherever fear paused long enough to breathe. There were darker currents too, fed by the choir's fractured song. A hushed murmur claimed the watchers were not angels, but functionaries, bound to a duty as mechanical as it was merciless. Someone spoke, too loudly and too near the chapel, of the black ships that rake the galaxy for psychers and feed their cargo to the golden throne, and wondered aloud if those harvests purchased hands across the warp, hands that held shut doors that wanted to open. The priest seized upon the speaker, dragged him before the altar, and made of his punishment a sermon. but punishment has a way of lodging the very thought it seeks to banish. Afterward, men looked a little longer at the astropath's hollow faces and could not quite decide if they prayed for them or through them. Among the Skitarii, the rumor translated into Binharic more efficiently than into Low Gothic. In clipped transmissions in cold harmonics, they speculated that the Watchers were protocols, autonomous guardians deployed by an ancient will, akin to void mines that detonate not with fire but with absence. A tech priest of no small seniority argued that such a theory verged upon the heretic, then saved his file to a hidden partition and sealed it under 12 machine seals. Even heresy aboard this ship sought somewhere to kneel. The captain kept to the bridge, where the hololith's green constellations rose and fell like a tide lung. He listened, as an officer recounted the observation blister sighting, and thanked the man for his honesty with a voice that did not betray his hunger for the smallest true thing. Later, alone by the forward view screen, he imagined the shimmer sparking with the outline of a giant, and almost laughed at himself. Almost. He was a man trained to believe what he could command, yet command is a language, and languages evolve in storms. He pressed his palm to the armrest and murmured a thought he would call a prayer, only if pressed. If there are hands beyond the veil, hold. The boy broke his silence once, and only to ask a single question that rolled through the hold like a loose bolt. "Do doors get tired?" he said. Eyes still unfocused, gaze set upon a seam of steel as if it were a horizon. A woman laughed, then clamped her mouth shut as if she had revealed something indecent. The priest, passing, paused as if he might answer, then felt the answer arrive in his own mouth uninvited. Yes. He swallowed it like a poison and placed his Aquila between himself and the boy's small, steady voice. Night, such as it could be measured in the warp, settled again. In that strained quiet, the ship heard a new sound, faint as thread pulled through cloth. It came from the maintenance rings, the soft rehearsal of movement where no patrol walked at that hour. A pair of sentries went to check and found boot imprints on dust that should not have been there. The prints were too broad for any crewman and too deep for the firmness of the deck, as if the metal had, for a moment, consented to remember weight. They followed until the marks ended before a bulkhead, blank as uninscribed bone. One sentry raised his hand to touch. The other seized his wrist and shook his head, and together they knelt, without being ordered, because either gesture, touch or restraint, felt insufficient without a third, reverence. The astropaths chanting frayed into silence mid-verse. Those on the bridge turned toward the choir as if sound possessed mass and had fallen to the deck. A moment passed, then another, long enough for the captain to taste the copper of panic. When the voices resumed, they were human again, cracked, exhausted, but their own. Later, one thin choirsman admitted to the priest that in the break, he had seen a door closing upon a light so bright it left no shadow, and for a heartbeat he had loved the shadow more. He begged penance, as if begging for a blanket. The priest gave it, and then knelt alone in the sacristy and bit the inside of his cheek until he bled, tasting iron to prove he was still made of blood and doubt, not glass and certainty.
The navigator spoke, finally, not to announce a bearing or a shift in current, but as if answering a question no one had dared ask aloud. "There are paths we are not making," she whispered. "They are made for us when we choose rightly." The captain did not inquire what rightly meant inside a place where truth arrived wearing other people's faces. He simply said, "Then we will keep choosing," and hoped his voice did not sound like a plea. When the sirens hiccuped again, another phantom alarm, another test of a heart that refused to steady, the crew's eyes went not to the priest, nor to the captain, nor even to the hololith. They lifted their gazes to the flicker in the air, to that faint gold where the Gellerfield pressed back against an ocean, and in that collective upward glance there was the shape of a people who had added a new stanza to their creed without consulting a book. Whether they had invited salvation or only named their fear by a kinder title, none could say. The ship moved on. The shimmer held. The longer the voyage endured, the more the line blurred between liturgy and rumor,
between guardians and predators. The ship had become a crucible where every whispered tale was tested not against truth, but against need, and need was bottomless. Some swore that the Adeptus Custodes could hear every prayer spoken in fear, that across the immeasurable gulf their golden helms turned when a mortal whispered the Emperor's name with enough desperation. Others countered that it was not the custodians who heard, but something else, something that only wore their image because the human mind needed armor and spears to imagine protection. Still others muttered of black ships dragging more than psychers into the warp, carrying chains and sacrifices meant to bind watchers no one wished to see. The captain allowed the stories to breathe, because silence bred madness faster than lies. But in private, he feared what they signified. A divided ship is a weakened ship. Faith was already cracking, and now its pieces sharpened into blades aimed at each other. One group prayed for golden guardians, another prayed for shackled wardens, a third kept silent, eyes wide in the dark, afraid that even prayer was a form of invitation. In the choir's chamber, the astropaths began a new hymn, one not found in any sanctioned liturgy. The notes were jagged, too raw to be composed, yet their voices wove together with a coherence that made the skin crawl. They sang of gates without hinges, doors that opened inward forever, and eyes that stared through every seam in the hull. The priest stormed in with his censer blazing, choking the chamber with smoke, demanding silence. But when the smoke cleared, the astropaths had already stopped, as if they had only been waiting for him to arrive. Their faces were wet with tears, yet their eyeless sockets turned to him with something that felt less like sorrow and more like pity. And in the crew holds, the boy spoke again. Only a single phrase this time, soft but clear, carried by the hush that followed the astropath's silence. The watchers are waiting. His mother sobbed, pressing his head against her chest, but the words had already spread. They were repeated in work gangs and mess lines, in the corridors and the chapel. They were whispered into bulkheads and scratched into tin plates. It did not matter what he meant. It mattered that someone had said it. That night, the Gellerfield shimmered brighter than it had in days, a steady golden dome against the unseen tide. The crew told themselves the watchers had heard, that they stood guard, just beyond sight, holding back the flood. Whether they believed it because it was true, or because it was all that remained to believe, no one asked. The warp does not care for the difference. The ship sailed onward, deeper into the storm, with shadows pacing it step for step.
Beyond the veil of steel and light, the warp shifted like an ocean caught in eternal storm. The ship had endured fractured fields, whispers, the burden of faith, and the birth of rumor into belief. Yet none of it could disguise the truth that bled through every seam. They sailed not through stars, but through a sea of gods. The Imperium was never empty. Even when the Geller field blazed strongest, shadows moved just beyond its reach, vast and patient. Some took the form of wings that spanned horizons. Others coiled like serpents made of fire and memory. Most had no form at all, only weight, only hunger, only the cold certainty that they had been there long before mankind dreamed of Terra's dawn. These were not illusions, they were not visions. They were the eternal predators of the warp, watching with infinite patience as mortals cut frail paths across their domain. The crew did not name them, though every man and woman felt their presence. To speak of them aloud was to grant them teeth. Still, whispers crept through the ship like spores. Korn, the blood god, who drank the rage of 1 billion warriors. Tzeentch, the changer, who wrote futures in fire and lies. Slaanesh, whose name was a sin to utter, whose hunger was pleasure without end. And Nurgle, the lord of decay, who offered not death, but eternity in rot.
The Imperium forbade their names, branded them heresy, and yet the warp breathed them into the hearts of men, whether they wished to know them or not. The astropaths spoke less now, drained of voice. But when they did, they spoke of cities glimpsed in half-vision, impossible structures rising like broken crowns above seas of flame, towers that bent like reeds yet never broke, bridges of bone stretched across gulfs of screaming light. Some swore they had seen vast thrones in the storm, where the gods sat unmoving, their presence alone a weight that bent thought and time. Were these glimpses real, or were they nothing but the warp wearing masks for human eyes? None could know, for the warp is both lie and truth, both dream and prison. The navigator endured these visions most of all. Her lips no longer formed bargains, but confessions. She whispered that sometimes, when she opened her third eye, she saw not paths of light, but chains of fire dragging the ship forward against her will. She said the Astronomicon burned not as beacon, but as pyre, its fire a scream that echoed across eternity. Some attendants wept at her words. Others cursed her as a heretic. The captain said nothing, but each night his eyes grew darker with doubt. And still, amid despair, stories of the emperor's hand persisted. A gunner swore that in his dreams a golden light had parted the storm, and within it he felt warmth, true warmth, like sunlight. Another claimed that when his hand trembled at the gunnery console, it steadied as if held by one unseen. Even the priest who had thundered against doubt until his voice broke admitted in a whisper that once, as the hull groaned with unseen pressure, he felt a hand upon his shoulder, a hand that bore no weight but filled him with a strength not his own. These stories spread as fast as tales of the gods, proof that faith could not be drowned entirely by whispers of ruin. Yet what was faith in such a place? Was it shield, weapon, or simply the last illusion mortals could carry before the warp stripped them bare? No one knew. They prayed because to stop praying was to invite silence, and silence was always the moment before the laughter began. The ship drifted onward, a single fragile lantern in an eternal abyss, carrying within it 1,000 souls who knew they were not alone, though they prayed to be. The hours thinned and stretched until the ship felt like a thought held too long, an ache behind the eyes. In that ache, men began to collect small proofs the way pilgrims collect dust from holy roads. A rating in the manufactorum found his data slate displaying a star map that did not exist, lines of pale fire drawing a path through nothing. He blinked, and the map vanished, leaving only maintenance logs and heat tolerances. He swore the lines had curved toward a brightness he could not name. Not the Astronomicon's steady blaze, but a brief flare like a match struck in a tomb. He pressed his thumb to the slate's edge and felt it warm, as if remembering a touch that was not his.
On the gun decks, a servitor faltered mid-cycle, its augmentic arms hovering above the macro feed as if listening to a distant command. The crew stepped back in a ring, the way men do when lightning finds metal. The servitor's vox clicked once, then twice, and from its grill spilled a single syllable that was not a word but felt like one, a pulse of sound that left the hairs along the forearms standing. A tech priest severed its line with a swift thrust of a sanctified plug, oil blooming black along the deck like a shadow made visible. No one spoke of what they had felt, because the feeling had been hope, and hope was dangerous when it arrived wearing a machine's mouth. The priest, worn to sinew and smoke, began to shorten his sermons and lengthen his silences. He listened at the edges of the choir's ragged hymns, as if waiting for an answer that would not shame him to repeat. When men asked if the emperor heard them, he said yes with less thunder and more bone. He told them that hearing did not always mean answering, that the Golden Throne's burden was a weight beyond mortal measure, that the Astronomicon was a mercy that burned itself to grant their passage. And when they asked if mercy could run dry, he said no quickly, like a man kicking a door closed before the wind could enter. The navigator ceased bargaining and began measuring. Her attendants recorded the tremors in her hands, the length of her breaths, the intervals between the flutter of her eyelids when the third eye turned inward. She whispered that the currents were no longer conflicting, merely converging, threads drawn toward a mouth in the storm. She did not name it. She spoke instead of eddies that smelled of ash, of warmth that stung like grief, of a silence that hummed the way steel hums before it fails. The captain stood in her sanctum and let the words strike him like cold water. If the storm had a mouth, then it had a throat. If it had a throat, then ships might pass through it the way knives pass through cloth. He did not speak the thought aloud. Blades only cut because something weaker offers itself to be divided. In the crew holds, the boy finally slept without staring, though his sleep was shallow and his hands curled as if gripping a rail. When he woke, he told his mother he had been walking along a pier that had no end, and beneath it the water was made of voices. He said he kept walking because stopping felt like drowning. She kissed his forehead, cool and dry, and said that walking was a kind of prayer. Around them men pretended not to listen, each silently counting footsteps that would carry them to the other side of a sea that had no shore. A rumor threaded itself through the mess lines that a black ship had once traveled the same current and never returned, that its cargo of psychers had been found centuries later frozen in a single exhalation, faces uplifted toward a light that had not wanted them. The rumor ended with a choice, as rumors do, that the light was either the emperor testing their faith or one of the gods testing their hunger. The choice mattered more than the truth. Men repeated the version that let them sleep for an hour. The Scutari, precise even in fear, began to mark time by the pattern of interference crawling their augmentic feeds. One veteran outlined the disturbance across a data slate like a cartographer mapping rivers, and in the lines he found repetition, a loop that returned not to the start but to a point one hair to the right. He showed it to a tech priest who raised a ribbon of incense and called the pattern beautiful, the way certain dangerous things are beautiful because they suggest order where none should be. They burned the slate in a spirit stove and did not watch the smoke. On the bridge, the hololith's runes steadied, as if the machine spirit had found a chant it trusted. The captain let his gaze soften until the green became a field, and beyond that field he imagined the shimmer, and beyond that shimmer a breath of darkness with room enough for giants to stand shoulder to shoulder. He imagined spears held point down in patient vigil, imagined hands opening and closing on nothing, imagined faces that were helmets and helmets that were faces. He told himself imagination was a vice that chewed through discipline, then allowed one more image: Terra under a sky the color of iron, the palace a wound of stone and gold, and within it a throne that hummed like a star harnessed to a loom. He did not know if any of that was true. He knew only that men must picture what they cannot bear, or they will become what they fear.
When the laughter tried to slip back into the bones of the ship, it found fewer hollows to inhabit. Not because the warp had grown kinder, but because the crew had learned to fill themselves with sound that belonged to them. They recited work logs aloud, sang broken marching songs, named every deck plate they crossed as if friend by friend. The priest did not stop them. He added a refrain under his breath, a small line from a forgotten catechism: "Hold fast the hinge." He did not explain it. He did not need to. Men understood doors even when they did not understand thrones. The ship shuddered once, a full-body recoil, like a beast refusing a bridle, and then the Jeller field burned so bright the golden edge was visible in the bridge's forward pane, a thin halo curving like a promise. Somewhere far below a bell tolled again, the bell no one had installed, and the note walked on, patient and unhurried, as if leading rather than warning. The captain lifted his chin to follow it with his ears,
and for a breath he felt he might follow it with the ship. The boy stirred, and the mother did not hush him. The navigator's lips moved in a count that did not match seconds. The astropath's song narrowed to a single held tone, thin, almost breaking, the sort of note that can slice or sew. On a maintenance ring, a door that had never been there remembered how to be closed. In the manufactorum, oil hissed into flame and burned clean. On the gun decks, hands steadied without knowing why. The warp pressed close and the shimmer held, and somewhere between pressure and light, a space opened the width of a breath. The ship no longer felt like steel. It felt like a thought that had grown too heavy, sagging under the weight of belief and fear. Every rivet was a prayer. Every corridor was a psalm. And yet the warp pressed closer still, as if mocking the audacity of mortals who thought words could keep eternity at bay. The priest no longer thundered. His voice had broken on the wheel of exhaustion, worn down to a rasp that trembled with each syllable. He walked slowly now, his censer trailing faint smoke, the Aquila clutched in a hand so tight it had fused to his skin in bruises. But though he looked like a man unraveling, the crew clung harder to him, for his weakness seemed truer than any sermon. When he whispered, they leaned in with desperate hunger, mistaking fragility for prophecy. The astropaths had reached their end. Their bodies lay pale and skeletal, their mouths opening only to breathe the last remnants of hymns that sounded more like sobs than songs. Yet in their silence, others claimed to hear voices, faint, distant, echoing as though carried through a canyon of stars. One woman said she heard her dead sister calling her name. Another swore she heard a custodian's voice telling her to keep walking. Still another said she heard nothing at all, and in that nothing, she had felt the Emperor more clearly than in any word. The line between delusion and miracle blurred until no one cared to separate them.
The navigator was the last to speak plainly. She raised her head, veil slipping to reveal eyes hollowed by strain, and whispered that she could see the Astronomicon again. But it was not steady. It burned and faltered like a beacon drowning in storm water, flaring, vanishing, then returning again in fits of tortured light. She said that it was not a star, it was a man who burned forever on a throne of gold, his agony stretched into eternity so that others might see a path. Some wept at her words, others cursed her for breaking their faith, but all of them knew she had spoken truth. For the warp was not fought with steel, but with sacrifice. And there could be no greater sacrifice than a god who refused to die. The boy whispered again, and this time his voice carried to every corner of the hold, though he did not shout. "It is opening," he said. His eyes wide and unblinking stared into a bulkhead as though through glass. His mother screamed and begged him to stop, but he only spoke again. "It is opening." And then the hull shuttered. Not the shutter of failing steel, but the shutter of something vast brushing against the Gellerfield, pressing against the golden dome that burned above them. The air thickened, tasting of copper and ash. The lights dimmed and flared, and for one unbearable moment every soul aboard the vessel felt themselves seen not as individuals, but as a single fragile spark trying to cut across eternity. The warp howled. The whispers rose into a chorus, and the shimmer of gold burned brighter than it ever had before. The golden shimmer blazed until it hurt to look upon, a dome of light so fierce it painted the decks in molten hues. Every face turned upward, every throat stilled, every fear silenced by the sheer immensity of it. The warp screamed outside, voices splintering into 1,000 contradictory cries, rage, hunger, temptation, despair, but all of it washed like tide against a wall of radiance that did not break. For the span of a heartbeat, perhaps longer, perhaps shorter, the crew felt something they could not name. Some said it was the Emperor's hand brushing against them through the storm.
Others whispered it was the gatekeepers at last, standing shoulder to shoulder in their eternal vigil. Still others said it was nothing but the Gellerfield burning at its last strength, a machine refusing to yield. Yet belief did not need truth. Belief only needed that moment, and in that moment they endured. The captain gripped the armrests of his throne, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. He did not pray, he did not command. He only stared into the halo of light and dared to believe, for the first time since the voyage began, that survival might still be possible. The navigator's voice trembled in his ear, whispering of currents shifting, of a path opening where none had been. The astropaths wept in silence, their eyeless sockets lifted toward the glow. The priest collapsed to his knees, not in thunderous devotion, but in the quiet surrender of a man who had carried faith further than he thought possible.
And the boy, sitting small in his mother's arms, smiled for the first time since the veil had fractured. His lips moved, forming words too soft to hear, but his eyes gleamed with something more ancient than innocence, more steady than fear. His mother wept into his hair, clutching him as though he were the last candle in an endless night. Then the light dimmed, the shimmer receded, steady but no longer blinding, the dome once more the familiar hum of the Gellerfield. The howls of the warp withdrew, like predators snarling from beyond the fire's edge. Silence filled the ship. Real silence. Not the silence of whispers held at bay, not the silence of fear waiting to speak, but the silence of reprieve. They had not escaped the warp. The voyage was not over, but they had endured its gaze and still lived to breathe another hour. In the Imperium, an hour was victory enough. No one spoke of what they had seen. No one needed to. The moment lived in every breath, in every tremor of the deck, in every flicker of the lumen strips. They had glimpsed eternity, and eternity had glimpsed them back. And so the voyage ship sailed on, carrying its fragile cargo of souls through the ocean of gods, its Gellerfield shimmering like a lantern in the dark. Behind them stretched only storm and whispers. Ahead, only storm and whispers. Yet between them burned a light that could not be named, only endured. Whether it was mercy, illusion, or the shadow of a throne that refused to crumble, none could say. But in that endless abyss, even the faintest light was enough to walk toward. And walk they did, step after step, prayer after prayer, into the eternity that waited beyond.